Hello, and thank you once again for joining me for another presentation in the GreyLearning Webinar Series, once again sponsored by Tamron. Today, admittedly, this topic might not sound like the most exciting webinar topic that you've ever seen, but I think this one will be especially helpful, and it's a topic I've actually been talking with a lot of photographers about recently. We've had a series of photo workshops this year, and that in particular gives me a chance to talk to photographers about some of the things they're struggling with in their workflow. And I've been hearing more and more about folders becoming a problem. I suspect part of this is that photographers haven't necessarily done the best job getting their folders spick and span, nice and tidy in the first place. And I imagine some of this also is just that over time, you accumulate an increasing number of folders. Your folder list starts to get longer and longer, and you start to feel that you're sort of drowning in those folders, perhaps. Fortunately, there's a couple of features in Lightroom Classic CC that will help us. Some newer features that I think are tremendously helpful. I'm really excited that those features are there. I will, of course, talk about those in just a moment. And speaking of me talking, of course, I am your host, Tim Gray. I'll be presenting here around about an hour, I think, today. I actually amusingly had to include this photo. I've been trying to include a photo of me, not so much that you really necessarily care to see what I look like when I'm presenting these webinars, but rather as a reminder that I should introduce myself. And that's one of the things I seem to always forget. And this was on a recent trip, and I was told after I smiled for the camera to look more natural. And I thought my smile was pretty natural, so I put this fake little pose on, and I was told this looked more natural. So apparently my natural state isn't very natural, but I digress. Thank you very much for joining me today. And also thank you to Tamron for making this webinar series possible. The GreyLearning Webinar Series, through generous support of Tamron, we're able to make all of this happen and keep it all completely free for all of you to attend. So we're grateful to you, first and foremost, for attending, and grateful to Tamron for making it possible. Now, one of the key factors, and part of the reason that I wanted to focus today's presentation on Lightroom as opposed to just folders in general, in large part, is because many of my followers, my readers, my listeners are using Lightroom to manage their photos. I'm increasingly hearing from more and more photographers that are using Lightroom. And also, part of my motivation is that my Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course continues to be one of my most popular courses that I've ever created. It may be even the most popular, which obviously signals that a lot of photographers have struggled a little bit with Lightroom. Hopefully today's presentation will help you with some of that. But the Cleaning Up Your Mess course, it contains more than 5 hours of content that drills into the very details of getting things cleaned up and organized in Lightroom. But in addition, we of course have a lot of other content. And so as part of today's presentation, I wanted to offer a discounted price on the full Mastering Lightroom Bundle, which includes the Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course. And so it's a pretty extensive bundle of courses. If you don't already have access to that, if you have the GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle subscription, keep in mind that you always get access to all of the new content as soon as it is published. But if you don't yet have that subscription and you're interested just in the Lightroom content, here's a special you can use. Just use the coupon code FOLDERS, as in the topic of today's webinar, or to have the discount built in for you automatically, you can simply point your web browser to timgray.me/folders. I'll put that link up again at the end of the presentation, but let's go ahead and dive in to our exciting discussion of folders, managing folders in Lightroom. And first, really kind of taking a step back and considering, why would we use folders at all? Well, in theory, some of you might not use folders, I imagine, or you might use an approach where the folders are sort of hidden from view. So for example, if you're using Lightroom CC, the cloud-based version of Lightroom as it were, then you're maybe already familiar with the fact that you don't really have direct access to your folders per se. You're using other constructs to organize your images and not folders at all, or at least not folders that you're working with directly. There's a date-based folder structure happening in the background that you don't actually control. Instead, Adobe is managing that in large part because Adobe is managing your storage. In many respects, you can think of that Lightroom CC as having all of your primary storage on Adobe servers, and then you just have local copies that are sort of a cache. In a manner of speaking, it's a little more complicated than that. But the point is that with Lightroom CC, the cloud-based version, you don't really have as much direct interaction with folders. So maybe we should just abandon folders altogether. Should we give up on Lightroom Classic and adopt Lightroom CC? Well, I, for one, am certainly not ready to get to that point yet, in part because I'm a control freak and I want to manage my files locally. But anybody who manages anything other than photos, I think, can appreciate the value of folders. And the analogy, of course, that was created long ago is that these folders are like manila folders that you might have in a file cabinet in an office. You wouldn't just dump all of your papers into a drawer. Well, hopefully you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't be able to track down the paper you need very easily if you did. And so the idea is that by having your documents divided into folders, that you'll be more easily able to find what you need when you need it. And with the computer, really folders are kind of an artificial construct anyway. They're not a tangible physical thing necessarily. And so I would say that the folders aren't really there. They're just a way to help organize, but they're a way to help organize. And so a key reason that I consider using folders in a photographic workflow to be critical is that we want an organizational structure. We want some sort of system for organizing that goes beyond the software we're using. I, for one, don't want to assume that I'll always be using the same software forever, and that if I need to change software, that there will be an easy path to migrate from one to the other. I'm thinking of Apple Aperture users who had a really difficult time with many aspects of their workflow transitioning from Aperture to something else. By having folders essentially out at the operating system level, it gives you a very base level organizational system. And by the way, I hear from a lot of photographers who are not yet using Lightroom that one of the reasons they don't want to use Lightroom is they don't want to give up the great folder structure or strategy that they've developed over the years, that they've been using consistently for years. They don't want to lose it. Well, with Lightroom Classic CC, you won't lose that structure. Lightroom, as you'll see shortly, will reflect your actual folder structure out on the hard drive, and you can continue using your same system of folder structure. Naturally, of course, we'll talk about what that structure might want to look like, some of the various attributes of that folder structure to help you essentially kind of define pieces of your workflow a little more effectively. So first and foremost, let's consider at a very basic level, folder strategy. And I know many of you have probably figured this out already, or maybe you haven't necessarily figured it out, but you've got a system that you're using. But I thought it would be valuable to have at least a little bit of discussion about it so that we can kind of level set again and maybe consider whether we might want to make some changes. So fundamentally, in my mind, a folder structure is there to organize your files, in this case photos, in some way. And so then the real question, I think one of the first questions you would want to consider when you were creating or changing your folder strategy is what goes in each folder. More to the point, how do you cluster your images together? Are we talking about folders based on time of year? Or are we using folders based on locations that you visited, or events that have happened, or species that you're photographing, or clients that you've worked for? And as we'll discuss in a moment, there are all sorts of different possibilities for how you might group your photos together. And I think a big part of how you can best develop that strategy is to think about how you think about your photos. In other words, and this will come up in just a moment as we talk about naming those folders, but what is it that causes, in your mind, certain photos to belong together and certain photos to belong apart? And this is probably at the core, I suspect, for many of you, of the type of photography you do. I always like to poke a little bit of fun at wedding photographers and say that they have it so easy when it comes to organizing their photos because it's just on a per wedding basis. They put the photos from a given wedding into a folder for that wedding, and conceptually, a big part of their workflow in terms of organizing is finished. It's pretty straightforward and easy. So they have it easy. except for the part of having to deal with the bride and groom and all the stress of a wedding day and everything hopefully going perfectly, etc. It's a more stressful job, I think, than I would want to have. But again, it's a relatively straightforward workflow. For other photographers, it's not so simple. For me, it's reasonably simple, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But one of the tricky examples that I often talk about is if you're a New York City-based street photographer and what you do is just go out every day and wander around and see what you see and photograph it, you can't necessarily structure it based on even the neighborhood you visited, because it might be somewhat random over the course of, days and weeks and months. In theory, date, but that's not necessarily all that meaningful. So for somebody who is sort of, in a manner of speaking, doing the same thing over and over again, but where there's not necessarily a clear distinction between photos from, one day versus the other, or 1 week versus the other, that's going to be a little more tricky. You might need to spend some more time thinking about what will make sense as far as that folder strategy. And then I think what this ultimately leads to is a folder naming convention. And I've seen so many photographers out there who want to tell you exactly how you should be naming your folders. And I don't take that approach. Instead, what I suggest is that you use a naming convention that makes sense to you. And specifically, and this goes part and parcel with the strategy, that basic strategy for folders. In other words, how are you going to compartmentalize your photos? Well, the name should simply reflect that compartment, if you will. So if you are a wedding photographer, then of course the folder naming is probably something like the client's name, the name of the couple that's getting married. Or if you're a commercial product photographer, it's probably the company that hired you to photograph their product, or the name of the product you are photographing, or whatever makes sense in that context. If you're a travel photographer, of course, it's going to be mostly location. If you're a journalist, it actually might make the most sense to use a date-based folder structure. Now, for me personally, a date-based folder structure does not make any sense at all. For me, not for other photographers necessarily. I've met more than a few photographers for whom date-based works perfectly fine. It doesn't work well for me, in large part because half the time I don't even know what date it is today, let alone when I captured a particular photo. So if I was using strictly a date-based folder structure, I'd probably rarely, if ever, be able to actually go track down a particular photo. Even if I captured a photo on my birthday, I probably couldn't remember how old I was that particular year. And so for me, that doesn't work because of just not having necessarily as much awareness as other people do when it comes to the dates, or as much of a memory for those dates. But also, I feel that there's a degree of being duplicative in that my photos already have a date. At least my digital captures have a date of captured embedded in the metadata, and I can always filter or search based on that date. So if I actually did know the date or wanted to know the date, I could track that down in metadata. So it feels a little bit duplicative. Not that the folder naming structure that I use wouldn't be duplicative of other things as well, but that's just part of my thought process. And actually, I was hoping all of you who are joining me live here today would help me out a little bit on two fronts. And really, this is about curiosity on my part. Number one, I'm curious about the answer to the question. And number two, I'm curious how this little feature works in the context of a webinar, because I've actually never used the polling feature in one of the webinars in the GreyLearning Webinar Series. And I think it might be useful, or at least fun for me. So I hope you'll bear with me. And I'm going to present here a poll, and the question is essentially, what is your primary method of organizing your folders? Meaning, how do you name your folders? And so if you choose one of those options and submit your answer there so that we can get a sense of how you're organizing. Is it by date? Is it by a photo shoot or trip? Is it by subject matter? So, for example, locations or species that you photographed. Is it with random disorganization? I'm hoping nobody selects that. If they do, then I guess they really need that video course that I was talking about earlier. Or is it something altogether different that I didn't pick up on with the options that I included here in this poll? So we'll give that just a moment here to get some more responses. We were hoping for millions of responses to the poll so that we'd have really good scientific data. I'm not sure that we've hit those numbers in terms of live attendees here today. We'll have to check the metrics later and see how we did. Looks like we're gradually winding down here, though. We do have some random disorganization responses already, not to give it away before we close out the poll. All right, so it looks like we're wrapping up, and a few more people still casting their vote. Actually, quickly casting the vote. The numbers keep climbing here, so we'll give it just another moment here, and then we will reveal the results and see if it is surprising to you, if it's surprising to me, and what it translates into. All right, looks like that's wound down, so I'm going to close the poll, and I have to admit that I am a little bit surprised. And of course, it depends on how you define some of these terms, so admittedly, there will be some variation, but let's go ahead and share those results. A fairly even split among the key methods, you might say, for defining your folder structure. And I'm only a little bit surprised that by date garnered about a third of the results, because I do talk to a lot of photographers who use a date-based structure. Now, some of them, when I talk to them, they say, well, I learned that from another teacher a long time ago, and so now I'm sort of stuck with it unless I want to do a lot of work fixing those names. But I've also talked to a lot of photographers for whom that actually works really, really well. And so I guess my answer or my suggestion would be that if you're using a date-based folder structure, think about, are you using it because it really works for you, or because you have other long-term issues? So, for example, wanting to be able to pass on images in a way that's meaningful to others in terms of the folder structure, or is it just old habit and you think maybe it might be worth changing at some point? Then you have to consider whether it's worth going back and cleaning up and renaming and consolidating all these folders. But in any event, something to consider. Now, photo shoot or trip and then subject matter location, some of that could be a little bit duplicative, meaning you could interpret one way or the other. But this gets at, and I had a question ahead of time from someone who is I'm sure probably listening right now. And essentially what it boiled down to was she's using photos in part as elements in composite images. And so how do you organize those and moving them into folders? Well, if you put them into folders, here's skies and here's textures and here's water and here's what have you, that's a lot of work of moving files around on your hard drive as opposed to using some other construct. And so I might suggest that using things such as collections and keywords would be a little bit more useful for that type of granular detail. So interesting, certainly. I think this shows that a majority, or basically perhaps nearly everyone, a couple random disorganization or something else, but mostly people are presumably organizing based on what makes sense to them, and I think that's perfectly great. So in terms of then defining a little more deeply that folder structure, then we would also want to consider whether we're going with a flat structure versus a deep structure. So meaning when it comes to the actual folders, we've talked about this very basic concept of what each folder will contain, and then the naming structure, which in large part is sort of almost categories for the folders. And then the other concept, of course, would be taking that a step further, and is it a deep structure or a flat structure? And so let's actually switch over to Lightroom here, and we'll take a look in a somewhat, I guess you could say, real world. I mean, this is just a demo catalog, so it's not really an active working catalog. This is one I use for demonstration purposes, but meaning that, am I going to have lots and lots of folders in a list, or am I going to have a deeper structure? And so here you'll notice, and we'll talk about some of this and what I might clean up, but I don't have, for example, locations as a folder, and then Europe maybe as a subfolder, and then countries in Europe as subfolders still, and then cities in Europe further, making a deeper and deeper folder structure. Generally speaking, I think it makes sense to have a relatively flat folder structure. In other words, the flattest form would be simply a list of folders. So here, more or less folders based on the location. And so obviously, giving it away for anyone who didn't already know this based on my previous talks, webinars, and videos, etc., is that I use an approach that is primarily based on the trips that I take. And in large part, I don't really consider myself a travel photographer per se, but the vast majority of my photography involves travel, involves going somewhere. And really what I mean by that is when I think about my photos, what is sort of top of mind is that the location is the way I think about my photos. So if you ask about a particular subject, what's going to come to mind for me personally is where I was. Whales in Alaska, or crop dusters in the Palouse, or a cathedral in Italy, or whatever the case might be. And so I'm using a folder structure that's based on a per trip basis. So in theory, I would use a very flat structure where each folder represents a trip. And each folder therefore gets a name that is meaningful to me based on the trip itself, which obviously for me personally is often going to be location based. Not always, but for me most of the time. Now that doesn't make it the right solution for everyone. I think it's a sensible solution, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, there becomes a certain challenge to the workflow as far as now I've got too many folders. And there's a variety of solutions that we'll talk about to address that I hope will be very helpful in your own workflow. And so really, I think what this boils down to in my mind, when we're talking about flat versus deep folder structure, lots and lots of layers deep versus a very simple structure, I would make your folder structure as simple as makes sense for you. So don't start going deeper and deeper in that folder structure until you feel that you really need it. For example, if you're organizing by species, you might have birds and then raptors and then eagles and then bald eagle. That obviously is helpful when it comes to locating particular species, but it also involves a lot of work potentially in terms of bringing your images into Lightroom and now divvying them up amongst the various folders where keywords might work a little bit better. So you were in Alaska photographing all sorts of things, including bald eagles. Maybe it makes more sense to have an Alaska trip folder and then to assign keywords. Now, of course, it takes work to assign keywords to the photos as well. So there's no perfect, simple solution here. There's going to be a certain amount of work. Obviously, many of you, I'm sure, have seen some of the artificial intelligence, this ability to search your photos based on contents thanks to image analysis, including right inside of the cloud-based Lightroom CC. There's some very interesting things happening there that will help with our workflows, but I still think it doesn't replace you actually identifying specific information about your photos. Now, getting to the elements, and I mentioned the question from a viewer today, folders versus collections versus keywords. And collections and keywords I would lump into the same basic category here. What I mean by that is these are really just tags. Now, I talked about how a folder technically is really just an artificial construct of the operating system, but it's a little more durable outside of our image management software than something like a collection. A keyword would be certainly more durable in the context that it's written to the actual image file, potentially, depending on your specific workflow. But the point is that we have a folder structure so we can go find our images in a specific storage location, and then we have what amount to essentially metadata updates. A collection in Lightroom would really be just a metadata value, and actually it happens to be a metadata value that is only contained within your Lightroom catalog. The membership in a collection is not an attribute that is included in the actual image file out on your hard drive. So if you lost your Lightroom catalog, you would lose all of your collections. Keywords can be more durable if you save your metadata out to the actual image files. Keywords are among that standard metadata that is included, that would be written out to the files themselves. But really, at its core, I think there's a difference between storage structure and metadata. And so just as you store your photos on a hard drive, on that hard drive, you'll have a folder structure. That is a little more durable, you might say. It's a little more tangible than the metadata that you might add to your photos. So as a general rule, I recommend first figuring out what folder structure makes the most sense for your workflow in terms of how you think about your photos and how you're going to locate your photos, for example, and treat collections, keywords, and other metadata as ways to further refine the organization of your photos. Now, Lightroom CC, not Classic, but Lightroom CC, the cloud-based version of Lightroom, takes that to a whole new level in that you don't even see your folders. You just have your collections or albums and your other metadata such as keywords, but the folders are still there on the hard drive in a date-based structure that you don't control directly, but it is still there. So I do recommend having a folder strategy that is your first line of defense when it comes to organization. In other words, ideally, we're storing all of our photos on a single hard drive if you have one hard drive that can hold all of your photos, and we're dividing those photos into folders on the hard drive. That's the first additional level of organization. And then taking that a step further, we will have other metadata. We might create collections based on a project. We might add keywords, of course, based on subject matter or thematic keywords, etc. And so thinking of it sort of in that order, we start with our bigger decisions, you might say, the hard drive that we're storing on, the folder structure that we're using, and then collections and other metadata. So Tom mentions he's photographing primarily birds, and that for him it's really important to know the date and location during the year to track the species, which actually is a really good point in terms of having a folder structure then potentially that reflects when it was captured. In other words, seasonality, for example, different plumage at different times of year, for example, as well as where they were photographed. At the same time, I would add to that, and not that there's a one right answer, it's just really about how we think about this folder structure strategy. But the date, as I mentioned, is already in the capture, so you could filter based on that. And the species, of course, could be added as a keyword, and the location could be included in metadata as well, just by opting for a camera that includes a GPS receiver or recording a track log, because it's a real good example for nature photography where you might want to know where were these particular bird species nesting this year, and it could be useful information for a variety of reasons. So certainly, and I should underscore, there's not a single answer, and I would never suggest that my approach works for every photographer or would work for every photographer, but rather that all of this really is aimed at helping you think a little bit better about your folder structure. And as I mentioned, in part because I find that many photographers never actually gave it much thought. They just started creating folders, and it took on some degree of logic and a certain amount of chaos as well, so it might be worthwhile to revisit. And yes, Alan mentions use a date-based structure, but have named subject folders within them. And so obviously, when it comes to that folder naming, there is the potential. I reference name-based, such as a location, versus date-based. Obviously, we could mix and match a little bit. And in fact, you may have already noticed with my location-based folders, I still put, for example, a year there to indicate which year that trip was. So in a lot of respects, we're mixing and matching. Think of it more as what information goes first, so that when the folders are listed alphabetically, what is essentially the sort order of the individual folders. So, maybe date is first for some of you, location is first for some of you, but obviously mixing and matching, which I see a couple other photographers here indicating that they've got this sort of mixed solution, which it makes perfect sense and is perfectly reasonable. I do always try to look at those options, those approaches, and think, okay, but could we simplify that? And the answer is not always yes. Sometimes a little bit of complexity is needed to keep order. So just because we're adding complexity obviously does not make that a bad thing at all. But again, thinking about folders as sort of different things from the other metadata that we might update. So once again, coming into Lightroom so that we can take a look at some of this in a little bit more hands-on sort of detail. So obviously, as I mentioned, most of my folders in my real workflow are based on location information. And so really what this boils down to, and I'll talk more about searching for folders later, but it's when I'm browsing, I'm thinking about my photos in a particular way. Oh, hey, Tim, do you have any pictures of St. Peter's Basilica? Yes, I photographed that during a trip to Italy. No surprise there, right? And so for me, it's about what am I thinking about, and my folder structure reflects when you ask for a photo, what comes to mind, and therefore I'm going to scroll down the list and go to that place. Now, here, of course, as I mentioned, this is just a demo catalog, so I have all sorts of other folders that don't match that structure, but hopefully you can forgive that and this additional little element. So, for example, some optimizing samples for images when I want to show some adjustment techniques, for example. But what about when you decide that you've given some of your folder renaming some thought and you really don't think that your structure is necessarily the best structure, or your naming convention wasn't consistent, or you'd like to improve upon it? One of the most important things to know about Lightroom is that once you start using Lightroom to manage your photos, everything that you do with your photos should be done inside of Lightroom. And so, for example, if I scroll down the list here, you'll see that I have a folder called Trip to Croatia, which is obviously not a very good folder name in terms of an organizational workflow. When I think about my photos from Croatia, I'm never going to think trip. I mean, yes, it was a trip, but that's not what's going to come to mind. I'm going to think Croatia. Remember the cute dog that I photographed out in front of the shuttered windows in Croatia? Yes, that was in Croatia. So I'm going to go look for a folder called Croatia. And so if I have a folder such as you see here that is called Trip to Croatia rather than just Croatia, for example, probably not a good approach. Now, admittedly, I'll be keeping things here reasonably streamlined and simple just so that we can address some of these general concepts. Naturally, some of this could start to get rather complicated. So if you're using currently a date-based folder structure where each day has its own folder, so you've got year, month, and day, and you decide that you want to clean that up into a trip-based folder structure, now you've got to go in there and consolidate folders from a single trip. Let's say it was a 10-day trip. Now you've got those 10 date-based folders. You need to consolidate all into one, get rid of the empty folders, rename the one that remains. There could be a lot of work in there, but it's all the same basic tasks that I'm going to demonstrate here. It just is a little bit more complicated in terms of, well, really how much work you have to do, how many steps are going to be involved, how many total number of folders you're going to consolidate, rename, remove, etc. So first and foremost, let's talk about renaming. If you decide that a name for a folder was not the best name and you want to rename it, it's so incredibly simple, but don't do it out in the operating system. Do it right here in Lightroom. I mentioned that cleaning up your mess in Lightroom course. Not working directly inside of Lightroom for all of your tasks related to your folders and your files, your photos. That is the number one reason that photographers need that course in the first place, to help them clean things up. So right here inside of Lightroom, I can right click on the folder and choose the rename option so that I can give that folder a new name. And in this case, very, very simple, of course, except that I tapped the wrong key and renamed in a way that I did not want to. But I can just simply get rid of those leading characters, essentially. So it just is Croatia 2012, for example. One of the most common questions I get, maybe some of you are already starting to type this question into the question field here on the webinar. One of the first questions I get is, yeah, but then will that be reflected on my hard drive? Yes. Lightroom will respect what's on your hard drive. And that's why, by the way, you can't go out to the operating system and make changes. You need to do it inside of Lightroom so that, in effect, it's changed in two places. It's changed in your Lightroom catalog, and it's changed out on your hard drive itself. So once I click Save, in order to apply that change, if I scroll back up the folder list here, we can see that the folder was actually renamed inside of Lightroom. And in fact, I can also go out and take a look. In this case, since I'm on a Macintosh, I can right click on the folder and show in Finder. On Windows, that would be Explorer. And that will bring up a window on my computer here that shows me, sure enough, there is the folder out on the hard drive that was actually renamed. And the renaming, of course, is reflected right here inside of Lightroom as well. So critically important that you are renaming folders, and the same goes for the photos themselves, inside of Lightroom if you decide that you want to make such a change. In addition to renaming folders, you might find from time to time that you need to consolidate folders. So you divided some images up into more than one folder, and you want to consolidate them into a single folder. I mentioned the example of that date-based folder structure. That would be potentially, as I mentioned, a very complicated task. Well, actually, complicated isn't quite the right word. It's relatively simple. There's just potentially an awful lot of work involved. So that could be a little bit of a challenge. But let's take a look at what we can do in terms of consolidating folders inside of Lightroom. I've got one example here. There is an Austria 2016 folder, and there's also an Innsbruck 2016 folder. So for some reason, maybe this was two segments of the same trip, or whatever the case might have been, somehow I thought in my mind that I should have a separate folder for all of the images captured once I got to Innsbruck. But Innsbruck, as I'm sure you're aware, is in Austria. So it's the same trip, just a variation in terms of specific locations within Austria. I don't actually feel the need to have these photos separated. I could always assign keywords, for example, to assign location information, or you might be able to see on the thumbnails, there's a little push pin badge at the bottom right corner of each thumbnail, because I am using a camera that includes GPS coordinates, that has a GPS receiver. And so I'm able to just view my photos directly on the map if I wanted to. Point being is that I have other ways of achieving different organizational goals, being able to organize by location or date, etc. So I think in this particular example, there's no need to have these separate folders, to have some photos in the Austria folder and other photos in the Innsbruck folder. So the first thing I would do is decide which is going to be the folder that remains and which is going to be the folder that goes away. In this case, I will retain the Austria folder and I will get rid of the Innsbruck folder. But first, I want to take all of these photos from the Innsbruck folder and put them into the Austria 2016 folder. So I could simply navigate, of course, to that folder, click on any one of the images, select all, which I can select from the edit menu, of course, or just press Control-E on Windows or Command-E on Macintosh. And then I can point to any of the selected images and drag and drop. You'll notice that I have a big plus attached to my mouse at the moment, indicating, at least in theory, that I'm going to be copying these photos. But that is not the case, as you'll see in a moment. I will drag to the appropriate destination folder. Once again, notice that I am inside of Lightroom performing this task. I'm not going out to my operating system. In theory, you could move things around and then resynchronize, but there's a potential mess you'd be creating for yourself there. So instead, right inside of Lightroom, drag and drop the photos, in this case, all of the photos in a given folder. When I drop, then I'll get a confirmation dialog asking if I'm sure that I want to move the photos, not just in my Lightroom catalog, but also out on my actual hard drive. So I need to confirm this. Note that there is a Don't Show Again checkbox. So the next time you drag and drop, you will not be alerted to the fact that you're moving. I personally do not recommend turning on that checkbox because I just feel there's too much risk that you might accidentally drag and drop to the wrong folder or the wrong photos, etc. This gives you a moment to just sort of pause and say, okay, am I really sure that I want to move those photos, or am I really sure that I dragged into the right destination? In this case, I am, and I have all of you to alert me if I was making a mistake along the way. I'll go ahead and click the Move button to confirm, and you'll see our numbers changing here, counting down for Innsbruck and counting up for Austria, and eventually that Innsbruck folder will be empty. Now, I do strongly recommend that when you're performing a task like this, you go to the library filter bar, the backslash key on the keyboard will bring that up if it's not already up, and make sure that your filter is set to none, so that we're certain that we are not filtering the images, so that we're only seeing certain of the images. In this case, I did not have any filters set, and so all of the photos were selected in that Innsbruck folder, and they've all been moved to the Austria folder. Now I have an empty folder that I no longer need. I can simply right-click and choose Remove, and it will be removed, yes, from the hard drive as well as my Lightroom catalog. All right. Going beyond consolidating. Well, maybe it's not beyond. Going in the other direction of consolidating would be bifurcating folders. In other words, splitting one folder into perhaps two or more individual folders, which could potentially be a little more complicated, and the process is slightly more complicated. But I think this is one example, just like we talked about, I'm consolidating two very simple folders versus a really significant, complex date-based folder structure. Sometimes splitting might be from one folder into several different folders, and it might be across a variety of different trips or what have you. And so the same concept would apply, but obviously in some cases it might be just a little bit more complicated. So let's take a look at an example here within Lightroom with my sample catalog here of needing or wanting at least to bifurcate, to split into one of the folders. So you see here I have a Paris and Prague folder because this was really one trip. We went to Paris, then we went to Prague, one trip. I mean, I guess technically since we flew from Paris to Prague, you could call that two trips. But it was one bigger trip, at least in my mind. And so initially I might assume, oh, it makes sense. I'll just leave all of the photos in a single folder for the entire trip. But then later I might start to realize as I'm trying to find photos from one versus the other that this has just gotten more complicated than it needs to be. And as much as you could say it's maybe a little simpler to use a single folder versus two folders, I think that extra complexity in the folder structure will reduce complexity in terms of my overall workflow. And so I think this is an example where I would really want to split photos, at least for me personally, into two folders in this case rather than just one. So a little bit more complicated in that I first of all have to select just part of the photos here, which photos were in Paris and which ones were in Prague. Fortunately, when we're sorted by capture time, in most cases, that's probably reasonably easy as long as you can actually identify the contents of the photo. But I also am going to need a destination folder. So where will I be putting this folder, for example? If I'm going to create now a Prague folder, where is it going to be? There's nowhere for me to drag and drop the Prague photos at the moment. Well, there's a couple of options that are available here. Both of them involve creating a new folder. The question is, will it be a subfolder of an existing folder, or will it be just a brand new folder somewhere else out on my hard drive? Well, if I want to create a subfolder, then I need to be able to select the parent folder. And at the moment, with a relatively flat folder structure, the parent folder for all of these other folders that we actually see would be the actual hard drive. It's called My Photos. You can see that it's reflected up here. But by default, you're probably not going to see the actual hard drive listed as a folder. If that's the case and you want to be able to see it, you can right-click on any of the folders and then choose to show the parent. So I can right-click and show the parent. In this case, I'm already showing the parent. I can also right-click and hide the parent. So I can right-click on the hard drive, essentially, the My Photos folder, which really represents the hard drive, and choose Hide This Parent so that I'm only seeing the actual folders that contain my photos. At any time, though, I could right-click on a folder and choose to Show the Parent. So if I navigate to the parent folder, now when I click the plus button over to the right of the Folders heading on the left panel in the Library module, I could choose the Add Subfolder option. If I have not navigated to the parent folder, or I don't want to be bothered revealing and then hiding that parent folder, etc., I could also always use the Add Folder option, which will bring up a dialog where I can navigate to the intended destination, create a new folder, and that folder, an empty folder, will appear inside of Lightroom. And of course, it will be out on the hard drive that I selected as part of that process. But in this case, since I'm able to see the parent folder, I'll just go ahead and use the Add Subfolder option. Overall, the process is very similar in terms of just creating a folder with a new name. And then I will give this folder, of course, a name. So I'm going to call this Prague. And I think, if I'm remembering, I mentioned I'm not good with dates, right? But I think it was 2009. We'll find out if I'm right in just a moment. We'll assume that that's correct. So Prague 2009, and create as a child folder of this parent, if you will, or as a subfolder. And so if I scroll down, sure enough, here's my original Paris and Prague 2009 folder. And down below is the brand new and still empty Prague 2009 folder. So I need to go back to my Paris and Prague folder. I'm sorted by capture time, so in this case I happen to know the sequence will work out very easily. I can go find the first photo that was captured in Prague and then scroll down, and actually then we came back to Paris, so it's not as simple as I had remembered. There are more photos here of Prague, and then we switch back into Paris again, so I need actually this little middle section of photos that were captured in Prague in between time at the beginning and end of the trip in Paris. So having selected those photos, just as we saw before, very simple, now we're all experts at this, I can simply take those selected images, click on the thumbnail for any one of them, and drag and drop to the intended destination. And by the way, this is sort of a big deal in terms of moving stuff around in your organizational workflow. So I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of drag and drop, but I actually recommend an alternative to that, a variation on that. Drag, stop, and drop. Drag, get into the appropriate position, now stop, and make sure that you're actually pointed at the correct destination, the correct folder in this case, before you let go of the mouse button in order to drop. Because you'll notice that the dialog that appears saying, hey, are you really sure that you want to move files on the disk? It's asking if I'm sure, but it's not confirming the source or the destination. So I don't know for sure necessarily based on this dialog where I dropped. So all the more reason, instead of just drag and drop, drag, stop, confirm, and drop. And then I'll click move to confirm that change. You see those images flying away. So now there are 20 photos inside of the Prague 2009 folder. And the Paris and Prague 2009 folder only contains photos from Paris. That means, of course, it makes sense to rename this folder. So I will right-click and choose Rename, and we'll just get rid of the and Prague text, for example. So again, a relatively straightforward example of when we might want to split photos that are contained in one folder and split them into two, or of course, potentially more folders as well. In other cases, you might find that you want to actually create a parent folder. Some of you might have noticed this already, seeing some of the folder structure that I've got in my sample catalog here. And so taking a look at that once again, you'll see that there's Italy folders for 2014 and 2015 and 2016 and 2017 and another one for Capri. And this isn't even all of the folders that I actually have for trips to Italy. So this starts to get a little bit cumbersome in that I'm looking for a specific trip to Italy, but now I've got a long list of, maybe a dozen trips to Italy with individual folders for each one. It might make sense to consolidate. In theory, I could consolidate into a single folder, but in this case, I think it makes more sense to create a parent folder. So I've talked about how I prefer a more simple folder structure, a flat folder structure, if at all possible. But there comes a time where you just need a deeper folder structure so that you're helping to kind of contain some of the chaos that starts to develop over time. And so this is really just a process that we've already seen in terms of creating a new folder. And so I could go back to my photos, for example, and choose the option to create a new folder, meaning click the plus button, and then I can add a folder as a subfolder, or I could navigate out onto the hard drive. In this case, I will just use the subfolder option once again, and I will just call this Italy, because this is going to be, it's not yet, I suppose you could say, but it's going to be a parent folder for the Italy photos, for the Italy trips. So I'll just call it Italy, very simple, and click Create. And now you see that there is a brand new empty folder called Italy, and all of these other, not just photos, but actually folders belong within that parent folder. So the Italy folder is not yet a parent, but it's about to become a parent to these other folders. I could drag and drop one at a time, but I can also select multiple folders from the list. So I could click on the first folder for an Italy trip in this case, and then hold the Shift key and click on the last folder, and then drag and drop. Just as we can select multiple images, I can also select multiple folders, And then by dragging and dropping any one of the selected folders, all of the selected folders will come along for the ride. So once again, drag, stop, make sure I'm hovered over the right spot, release the mouse, and click the move button to confirm that I do indeed want to move those Italy individual trip folders into that new Italy parent folder. And one of the advantages, of course, is that I can collapse that parent folder so that it's just a little bit easier to navigate. So I can tidy things up a little bit. You see that I already had such a folder for those Austria trips. I could certainly create similar folder for the Palouse trips because I've got a dozen of those as well, or whatever the number might be at this point. So again, creating a parent folder that I can then contain multiple folders. Now here I'm doing that sort of after the fact based on trips. Of course, you might do this so that you can split up from a single trip photos into individual categories, essentially. So for example, many wedding photographers will divide their photos up into folders based on, for example, the getting ready photos, followed by the ceremony photos, followed by the reception photos as individual folders within a parent folder for the wedding itself. So again, all of this is just sort of examples of some ways you might implement these concepts. The specifics of how you do that will, of course, depend on your own specific needs and your own specific workflow. All right, so now that we've hopefully gotten some of these concepts down as far as how we're structuring and organizing and cleaning up our folders, a couple of new features in Lightroom Classic CC that I think are just tremendously valuable. In effect, we can kind of sort of assign a star rating to a folder. It's just a single option. It's a yes or no, so it's really a favorite folder option. We can also, as we'll see in a moment, assign color labels. So let's first take a look. You might have noticed, by the way, that one of my folders had a little star icon. This Italy 2017 folder has a little star next to it, which means that is a favorite. And so if I wanted to also identify another folder as representing a favorite, so not only can I filter photos based on a star rating, I can also filter folders now so that I'm able to get to my most active folders, perhaps, or my most favorite trips in this case, since my folders largely reflect trips that I've taken. And so if I wanted to identify another favorite, I could right-click, for example, on this Austria 2016 folder and mark it as a favorite. And you'll see a similar little star there. We'll talk about how we filter those in just a moment. But first, another option, in addition to being able to favorite our folders, we can also assign color labels. Now, if you've used color labels at all for your photos, this is the exact same concept. And the same sort of limitation applies in that you can only assign a single color label to a given folder, and those colors don't necessarily have any inherent meaning. So you would sort of need to figure out for yourself what that means. If you take a look at this Cruise to South America folder, for example, you'll see a little red marker out to the right. That is a color label. So you might use color labels, for example, to mark folders that you've not yet reviewed all of the photos from, to assign star ratings, for example, to the folders. I'll go ahead and right-click on another folder here, in this case, the Cruise to Asia, and I can add a color label and choose the particular option. Maybe green means that I need to put these into a project. I'm making an ebook about that trip, or whatever the case might be. I can define what those colors mean for myself, but again, being able to mark those folders within your folders list in Lightroom as having a particular color label. I think that's a tremendously helpful. For me personally, I would say that the star rating facility, meaning the favorites, is perhaps the more valuable of the two, but both could certainly be helpful. And then the coup de grace, you might say, the kind of grand finale of this is that we're able to actually search for folders or filter the folders based on those criteria. And so, for example, if I wanted to filter images, up at the top of the folders list, there is a search field. So if I'm looking for folders that are from Italy, meaning Italy trips, I could type Italy and see those search results. Or I could clear that out with the X, and I'm looking for Prague, and I can filter the lists that I'm seeing the Prague folder. In addition, might not be immediately obvious. This is just a search field where you type things. But to the left, the little magnifying glass that indicates this is a search field, there's also a little icon that indicates that there is a pop-up here. Right now I'm browsing all folders and potentially performing a text search based on all folders. But I can also filter only my favorites. So here's only my favorites, and of course their parents in the folder structure, or only my labeled, meaning color labeled folders. And so I can filter not just based on the text that appears within the actual names of those folders, but also based on a favorite status versus a color label. Notice, at least at the moment, we're not able to filter for show me the red color labeled folders versus green, so not exactly perfect in that respect. We can switch back to all, of course, when we're finished filtering, but still, I think a tremendously useful facility for organizing our folders. For me, for example, I find that I use my photos the most shortly after a trip. And so to be able to just mark my favorite sort of recent trips as favorite folders and then filter that list, it makes it a lot easier to navigate to those particular locations, to those particular photos, essentially, which is ultimately the whole point here, right? Is to get everything organized as best we can so that we're able to locate our photos later. So the whole point of putting all this effort into getting things organized, in this case, we've been talking obviously a lot about folders in the context of a Lightroom-based workflow, but the whole point is really to have everything organized so that we can better locate our photos later. All right, so we are just about out of time, but I do want to take a look here at a few of the questions. If I miss a question, I will do my very best to incorporate that into an Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. So if you're already receiving the daily Ask Tim Gray email newsletter and you've got a question there, but do feel free to send that to me via email and I'll do my best to get to as many of those as I can. So Thomas asked a really good question, actually. He made mention of my Italy folder structure here, and notice that the Italy folder, the parent folder, shows 0 photos, whereas obviously there are photos within that Italy folder structure because you can see the numbers for all of the individual folders. That's because I have an option disabled out of personal preference and to avoid some confusion. There are 0 photos actually directly inside this Italy parent folder. The only place that photos exist is within the subfolders down below. And the reason that you're not seeing that is that up on the menu, you'll see that under Library, I have Show Photos in Subfolders turned off. If I turn that option on, I will see the Italy parent folder shows a number, and it is the cumulative sum of all of the numbers you see down below for the child folders, the subfolders. The reason I don't like this is that it makes it appear that some of your photos, so here in the case Capri, it looks like those photos appear in more than one location. And I've actually had photographers who then delete photos from one location thinking that they're duplicative when in fact the parent folder is just reflecting what's down below. So personally, I prefer to have that option turned off so that I need to go to a specific folder. So I'm sure in this case, perhaps it was confusing that the number looked the way it is for you, but to me, it's maybe more confusing in the other direction. So I just find that that's my own personal preference. So Laura asked why I created a subfolder rather than a folder. So I navigated up to my hard drive, for example, and then created a subfolder from there. And really, it's just, I find that just ever so slightly more streamlined. So I go to the parent and then make a subfolder. A subfolder just means a folder inside the currently active folder. The add folder option could result in the exact same thing. It's just that now I need to go navigate out on my hard drive and go to the location where I want to create a folder and then create a new folder. So I'll just call this a test folder, for example. I will create it and click choose. And now I've created a folder out on that hard drive. You can see the folder right there. So I could have used either approach. It's just, I find it a little more streamlined to just choose the parent folder and then make a subfolder. So James asks, in the context of importing, do you recommend using copy, move, or add? And the copy, move, or add options during import would actually relate primarily based on where the photos are already. And so if the photos are already where they belong, you downloaded them with other software or you scanned them, maybe there were slides that you scanned with a film scanner, and you've put them into the folder that they belong in, then you would use the add option. Otherwise, I would use the copy option, because in a typical workflow, bear in mind that we are copying photos from our, for example, media cards or our cameras or our smartphone or whatever the case might be, to our hard drive, to the location where we actually want our photos to be stored. As a general rule, I would never use the move option, because I would either want the photos to be copied so that I've got a redundant copy as a backup, or I would want to simply add the photos because they are already where they belong. So Vance asks, he's got a lot of folders that show no images. Not sure how it happened, but is it safe to delete those folders? If the folder is indeed empty, then yes. The only thing I would caution is to make sure that it really is empty, and actually Lightroom would alert you to this in any event. But for example, this test folder that I just created, I would want to make sure that my filter is set to none on the library filter bar so that I know that that folder really is empty. And then I can right click and choose to remove. If the folder's not empty when you choose this remove command, Lightroom will actually alert you to that and say, wait a minute, you've got some stuff out on the hard drive, and it will remain on your hard drive, by the way, if that's the case. So Bob asks, when renaming a folder, how does it impact your backup? Now, part of that depends on how you're actually backing up your photos. But if you have renamed a folder, most software, if you're talking about a synchronization type of backup approach, which is what I use personally, that actually does slow things down a little bit in concept, because now you're removing files and copying files in the context of that backup. And what I mean by that is, if you rename a folder, that's very simple. But the software that is synchronizing these two hard drives doesn't exactly know that you just renamed the folder. It knows that the folder it's looking for is not there anymore, and that there's a new folder with a different name. And so on your backup drive, it would remove the original copy and recreate a second copy, at least in the context of the software that I'm familiar with. And so that would be slightly less than perfect as far as the efficiency of your backup. I'm sure some software is able to manage that perhaps a little bit more rapidly, but not something I would worry about significantly. Tom's got a good question here in terms of some of my folder structure that you see. For example, there are spaces in the various folder names, and of course I might have the same in the file names, and he's heard advice not to include spaces. My personal take on that would be that that advice is a little bit outdated. The main issue back in the older days when I was a wee little lad and we were first able to use more than 8 characters in a folder name, then we suddenly could have these longer names and we could add spaces. The problem is, for example, at the time, Windows versus a DOS computer system, they didn't both support those long file names that included spaces. And so there's variations on that in terms of just being careful about the naming that you use. I do recommend avoiding special characters as much as possible because they're supported differently on different operating systems. For example, on the Macintosh platform, you're able to use a slash as part of a file name or a folder name, whereas on Windows that is not possible. And so I try to keep special characters to a minimum, but generally speaking, in my typical organizational folder structure, I will leave the spaces in there. I won't use, for example, underscores or dashes in case of spaces. In some context with online, for example, then I might use underscores. But as a general rule, I would say in this day and age with modern operating systems, it's perfectly safe to make use of a folder structure or a file naming structure for that matter that includes spaces. All right, so we're a little bit over time. I want to thank you all once again for joining me today. We have captured the questions that were submitted, and so I will address as many of those as I possibly can in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. If you're not already getting the daily Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, you can go to asktimgray.com and sign up with your email address. There is, by the way, a weekly option as opposed to daily if you prefer. And I do want to mention once again a reminder that you can get the full Mastering Lightroom Bundle that includes the Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course for just $74 with the coupon code folders, or just by pointing your web browser to timgray.me/folders to have that discount included automatically. Once again, thank you to all of you for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun. I hope this has been helpful for all of you. And a shout out once again, thank you to Tamron for sponsoring the GreyLearning Webinar Series, making this series of presentations possible. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing all of you, I hope, on a future presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Thanks very much.